On February 25, 1991, an Iraqi Scud missile hit a warehouse in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, that had been converted into a barracks for American reservists. The missile was old. Its guidance system had drifted due to a software clock error that the United States Army knew about, had issued a patch for, and had failed to install on that particular Patriot missile battery in time. The Patriot system, which was supposed to intercept the Scud, calculated the incoming missile's position incorrectly by more than half a kilometer and never fired. 28 American soldiers died in their bunks. It remains the single deadliest attack on American forces in the entire Gulf War, and almost nobody talks about it today. Not because it was hidden, not because there was a cover-up, but because it did not fit the story that the Gulf War wanted to tell about itself. This was supposed to be the war of smart bombs and Patriot missiles and technology so advanced it made the enemy helpless. The Dhahran barracks attack was none of those things. It was a 30-year-old Soviet-designed missile, a software bug, an administrative failure, and 28 men who went asleep in a warehouse and never woke up. The unit was the 475th Quartermaster Company out of Greensburg, Pennsylvania. They were not combat soldiers in the traditional sense. They were reservists, supply specialists, the kind of men and women who in civilian life drove trucks and managed warehouses and coached Little League and showed up one weekend a month. They had been called up when the war began, shipped to Saudi Arabia, and assigned to a converted warehouse that everyone knew was in Scud range but that had, until that night, never been hit. Their names were read into the congressional record. They received military funerals. And then, as the war ended 4 days later in a blaze of victory parades and yellow ribbons, the country mostly moved on. Specialist Frank Allen of the 475th survived because he had stepped outside the building 10 minutes before impact to make a phone call home. He later said he remembered the sound before he remembered anything else. Not an explosion, a pressure, like the air itself decided to leave the room. Then the ceiling came down. The Army investigation that followed was methodical and damning. The Patriot missile system had been in continuous operation for over 100 hours at the time of the attack. The onboard clock used floating point arithmetic, a way of storing decimal numbers in computer memory. And over time, at very long operational periods, that arithmetic introduced a tiny drift into the system's time calculations. The drift after 100 hours of continuous operation was just over a third of a second. That sounds like nothing, but a Scud travels at roughly 1.5 kilometers per second. A third of a second of timing error placed the calculated intercept point more than half a kilometer away from where the missile actually was. The Patriot looked at its own math, decided there was no valid target, and stood down. The Army had identified this problem weeks earlier. A software patch existed. An Israeli defense team had actually flagged the same issue to American commanders after experiencing drift problems with their own Patriot batteries. The warning made it through the chain of command to most batteries in theater. It did not make it to Dhahran in time. That gap between knowing something was broken and fixing it before it mattered is the quiet tragedy underneath the official one. The 28 soldiers who died were not killed by Iraqi ingenuity or overwhelming force. They were killed by a clock that drifted and a memo that moved too slowly. In the middle of a war celebrated for its technological precision, the deadliest single attack on American troops came down to a rounding error and a paperwork delay. The families of the 475th have spent the decades since the war trying to make sure those names are not forgotten. At a memorial in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, 28 stars mark the wall. Most visitors to that town could not tell you what they are for. The men and women who died in Dhahran were not on the front lines when it happened. They were asleep. They were writing letters home. One of them, according to a fellow soldier who survived, had been talking that evening about what he was going to eat first when he got back to Pennsylvania. He had decided on his mother's pot roast. His name was Specialist Beverly Clark. She was 23 years old. She was one of the first American women killed in combat in the Gulf War, though the Army at the time was careful about how it used that word. Her mother kept every letter she sent home from Saudi Arabia. She gave them to a local museum years later because she said she could not bear to throw them away, but she could not bear to keep reading them either. The Gulf War lasted 100 hours on the ground. It was over so fast and so completely that the victory felt almost unreal to the people watching at home. But for 28 families in towns across America, the war did not end in 100 hours. It ended on the night of February 25th in a warehouse in Dhahran, with a sound like the air deciding to leave the room.